Welcome to Meaningful Interviews. My guest today is Mr. Paul Hamburger, or the way I call him, Reb Shlomo Hamburger, Reb Shlomo. Shlomo and I have been learning together Hasidus and the teachings of the Rebbe, Lubavitcher Rebbe's father, Rabbi Levi Yitzchak Schneerson, known as Rabbi Levi, for 3-4 years or so. And I remember the first time we met each other was, I believe, at the Ohel. Yeah. It was a Shabbaton that Chabad of Potomac, where he lives in Potomac, Maryland, they came for Shabbos to the Ohel, and they asked me to come to be the guest lecturer and scholar in residence. And this Jew, Reb Shlomo, comes up to me and he says, "What do you think about the idea of Anochi?" You know, I've been learning about Anochi, Hashem Lokecha, the beginning of the Ten Commandments, the Seres HaDibros. And he said, "Can I talk to you about it?" And I said, "Sure." I remember it like yesterday. I think it was in the afternoon. That's my recollection. Yeah. Shabbos afternoon, between the break. You know, we had a few hours that we were able to take a walk, rest. And he told me that he's identified, I think it was 144.
141. 141. Yeah.
141. The expert of Anochi. What the Torah mentions just in the Torah, right?
Just in the Torah,
not in the prophets and the Ksuvim, just in the Torah, correct. The word Anochi and its significance and its meaning. And I remember he told me that when he shared this with others, some people thought he was a little strange, like they've never heard of such a thing, and like, why waste your time, and really doesn't really mean anything. And I thought it was fascinating, and I really did. Because it was the first time in my life, and I've been learning Torah and teaching Torah for all my life. I've been around many people who were Torah scholars in many different ways, from the literal Talmudic to the Kabbalistic. So this was really an eye-opener, and we became good friends. And we'll talk more about it a little later in the program. But Reb Shlomo here is a Washington, D.C. attorney, and that too was very interesting. You know, here, you know, we've had in our program a doctor, a business person. This is our first attorney, and for a prestigious attorney with a prestigious law firm to delve into this topic and to write a book. Shlomo has written several works, one book, and other publications. I'm talking now besides his legal profession. That's if you care to tell us about this, we'll be more glad to hear. But we're really happy, Shlomo, that we're here, and that I can tell you personally, I've learned so much from you in many ways, and I really mean it. I'm not saying this because people have to hear that. When I learn with someone, and I try to learn from them, because there's so much to learn from everyone, regardless. They have a beard, they don't have a beard, they have a yarmulke, they don't have a yarmulke. There's a message of truth that if a person has it, it's valuable, and you need to take it and work with it. So without further ado, it's your turn now to tell us a little bit about your background, and we'll go from there. Go ahead.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Rabbi Dolphin. I too have enjoyed our learning together. I can't tell you how much I've gained just from our conversations, which I also consider learning, even if we're not learning a text. So it's beautiful, and I just love I love the relationship over the years, and I value it very much. So I think it would be helpful to put in context maybe a little bit about my background. I grew up as a conservative Jewish household. We went to a conservative synagogue, and back in the 60s and 70s, which was something of the heyday of active conservative Judaism, particularly in the Detroit area where I grew up, we would go to shul. There'd be 100 kids, if easily, all anywhere from 13 to 16, all fighting over who's going to do the laning this week, who's going to daven this week, who's going to daven that this week. And so we really had a real love for it that was instilled primarily by my maternal grandparents. And as I moved to the Washington area, I maintained my connection with the conservative synagogue. We actually helped start a new conservative synagogue in the Potomac area when we moved here in about we moved in 85, we started it in about 87, 88. And one of the programs that I started doing at that synagogue was that on Shabbos after Kiddush, we would all go into the library and I would teach about the upcoming Torah portion. What was going to, what it was going to be. So I would have to study the Torah portion. We'd go through it and I would add in my own explanations and of what was going on based on my research. And in doing the research for Parshas Yisro, I ran into a sicha of Lubavitcher Rebbe, written about Parshas Yisro, explaining the significance of Anochi, which you just mentioned. And so the way my brain works, I said, well, if the Rebbe says that Anochi is so significant, this must be true. So I said, I wonder if it's true all the time, or is it only true in those particular instances that he pointed out? So I found all 141 uses of Anochi in the Torah. And I set about analyzing each and every pasuk in the Torah, each sentence that used the word Anochi, to see if there isn't some deeper Kabbalistic or other meaning behind the use without at all taking away from the literal translation, but to see if there isn't something alluded to that's a little deeper each time it's used. And sure enough, there is. And as you say, I wrote a book. Yeah, there it is, the Anochi Project. And it's available at sefarimdeals.com, by the way, if anybody wants it, or you can email me and I'll get you a copy. And that was a multi-year project to research and analyze every one of those things on and off. I had no intention of writing a book. It wasn't in my dreams. I was, I'm just a Jew, who am I to write a book? I didn't have at the beginning anything at all to do with Chabad. I didn't know from Chabad at all. I just started analyzing it to see what I could find. And it was interesting to me. And then as I would go to shul and I started going to Chabad at Kiddush, we would talk about Anochi this, Anochi that. And so the book came about very simply. I got an email. I'm sorry, I had made up in my mind after a while, people were pushing me to write a book about it. So I made up in my mind, okay, I'm going to write a book. The very next day, I got an email, and the email said, do you have an idea that you would like to turn into a book? And if so, here is, we supply editing services and help you with the publication. And it turned out I had no idea who was behind the email. I sent the email and said, as a matter of fact, I do. Here it is. And it was Shimon Hellinger from Merkaz Anash, and it was his company. And so I sent him the text and he said, you've got a great idea here. Let's work on it. And there it went.
You mentioned that you came across a sicha talk of the Lubavitcher Rebbe. Was this while you were still a member and actively involved in the conservative shul, or this was when you started to go to Chabad already? This
was when I was still an active member of the conservative shul. So I had seen the English translations of the sicha on Chabad.org, it was the very beginnings, I guess, of Chabad.org online, but a lot of this information was available. Now, I didn't know what a sicha was. I barely knew who the Rebbe was. Okay, I see stories about the Rebbe. That's about all I knew, was the general stuff. I knew who the Rebbe was, obviously, but I didn't know much, beyond that in terms of his learning and his sichas and maimarim and everything else. And I knew Chabad.org because they would always send matzah for Pesach and they would be, candles for Hanukkah. So I knew, Chabad, but I didn't know anything about the philosophy. I didn't know anything about Hasidus and anything. So yeah, that was all before then.
Right. So I also want to I'll come back to this in a few minutes, but I remind myself now that you are a board member of Chabad International on campus. Is that correct?
I'm on the advisory board for Chabad on Campus International. Yep.
Right. So can you talk for a moment about, I don't know if the word transition is the right word, but you grew up, you told us, in a very educated, healthy, conservative synagogue and environment, and you've told me about your parents, your father. Reb Shlomo's father was a very prominent doctor. You could say maybe a few words about that. I think it's important to know what a little more about your background, and then what was it that kind of made you join a Chabad shul? I think people really looking at you and hey, this guy is a Washington D.C. attorney on a very prominent level. I think it's pension planning, right?
Right, retirement plans and the like. Yeah.
Yeah, with the top firms and wears a yarmulke and studies Anochi and studies Chassidus and studies Rabbi Levi, and well, this is something you don't find. You don't find this. So please address this if you don't mind.
When I was, I'd always had a feeling for Yiddishkeit. I've always connected to Yiddishkeit. And as I say, mostly through my grandparents on my mother's side, my maternal grandparents. They came from the shtetl in Belarus. And my grandmother's father was a chazan, and she was one of 11 children, and he was a shochet, was an educated man. And my grandfather was one of 5 children, and he was his mother died giving birth to the youngest child, and the father died shortly thereafter. So he was really tasked with raising it. And anyway, I would hear all their stories, and I was very much drawn to it and connected to it. And even throughout my years of growing up, when I was 14, I was studying with a rabbi, sort of a young Israel type rabbi. I would go to his house. My grandfather bought me my first set of Mikraot Gedolot, and I would sit and learn. He taught me how to read Rashi script, and he taught me how to read, and I could already read Hebrew, and I'd gone to Hebrew camps and things. So anyway, my father, on the other hand, grew up totally Reform. Reform as Reform could be. Didn't know an aleph from a bet. And when my older brother, was going to be bar mitzvah, my father decided he was going to learn how to read Hebrew, because he was very proud and he would not read from a transliteration. So he learned Hebrew in order to have an aliyah at his son's bar mitzvah so he could say it in Hebrew. And I remember my father learning Hebrew from the old records. They were called Habetu Shma, and hear and listen. And you would listen to these records, and he would sit there with that dictionary, and he would look up every word, and he was working very diligently. That was my father's approach to things. He was also a writer. He wrote medical books, a dozen or so medical books. And so that intellectual side of it, I think I really got from my father, that intellectual curiosity, that desire to really learn more. And so as I got more into my studies, my brother-in-law happened to have met the Chabad rabbi in Potomac. It was a new rabbi at the time. It was around 1999, 2000. And he said, you should really meet him. I think you would get along. You would like him. So I remember I went to meet him. We spoke for a long time. Then I came one time. I remember they were laughing at me because I came one time on Tisha B'Av and I came one time on Purim. And somebody said, let me get this straight. You only come to Chabad on the saddest day and the happiest day in the calendar. Can't you come in the middle? And so anyway, I would talk with the rabbi for hours at the time. And we would spend a lot of time together talking about Hasidus and talking about not even Hasidus per se, just ideas. What do you think about this? What do you think about that? And I now know that what we were talking about was Hasidus. We didn't frame it as Hasidus at the time. And as I learned more and started studying more, and I realized all of these ideas were all right out of Hasidus. It resonated with me completely. It was everything I thought independently was found in a sikha or a mimer of the Rebbe or some of the videos of the Rebbe and stories about it. And it was like, yeah, that is what I believe. And so anyway, I started going more frequently. We moved in the neighborhood of Chabad. So, we could be more Shomer Shabbos and everything else. And then, that's where I started. Now I daven Nusach Ari, and if I have to, when I was saying Kaddish for my father, and I had to go to shul, you have to grab a Kaddish wherever you can. If I had to go to an Ashkenaz shul and daven Ashkenaz Nusach all over again, it was like I was tripping up. I was so natural for Nusach Ari that I couldn't revert back. So it just resonated with me that way.
Thank you for that. And that leads me to another question and an observation. I find it fascinating that, a person who's an intellectual is in love with Reb Leivik's writings. Reb Leivik, the Rebbe's father, Rabbi Levi Yitzchak Schneerson's writing has it's a lot of Kabbalah, a lot of Jewish mysticism. There are a lot of things you can't explain rationally, So that's something, that's so interesting to me that, someone who's an emotional person who's involved with Judaism, with Torah, with Yiddishkeit, from the emotional perspective, I can hear it. For someone who's, who's sitting in Washington and dealing with world cases and then in the Torah world, involved in this type of study and interest and passion. Flamer has passion for these things. This isn't just it isn't just passing time, This is very interesting. How you balance the intellectual side, the emotional side, and the practical side.
So that's a great question. For me, my Yiddishkeit has always been part of my identity. That's who I am. And, I didn't start out wearing a yarmulke all the time at work. It actually, I started wearing a yarmulke all the time when I was saying Kaddish for my father again, because, I'm saying Kaddish 3 times a day. Your whole life revolves around it. So I get up in the morning, I put my yarmulke on, I daven shacharis. I take my yarmulke off, I go to work, and I put my yarmulke on and go daven mincha, and then I take it off, and then I go to Mariv, and I put it. I mean, this is ridiculous. And I just put it on and left it on, and that was the end of it. And somebody told me, if you start wearing your yarmulke at work all the time, you know what's going to happen? I said, what? He said, absolutely nothing. Nobody cares. And in truth, that was the reality. So I would meet with CEOs of major companies. I would go wherever, and I would always have my yarmulke on. It was part of who I am. My clients know it. Every now and then I'll be talking Torah with a client, or I'll be, it's part of who I am. And if you want me as your lawyer, you're going to know that every now and then we're going to talk about some great Torah idea that I just ran into, or I'm going to integrate it into the conversation. So it's, again, part of who I am. Now, the Reb Leivik side was interesting, because when I did the Anochi book, a friend of mine said, did you know that Reb Leivik wrote a book about Anochi? And I said immediately that is impossible, because I've talked to a million Chabad rabbis about Anochi, just like you, and not one person mentioned this book. It doesn't exist. So he says, no, I saw it in the book, The Early Years. You can look in there. Okay, I have the early years. I'm flipping through the footnotes, trying to find it, and I found it, and it was in Likutei Levi Yitzchak. There was an essay, a 7-page essay on the topic, and a letter from the Rebbe's father to the Rebbe, Erev Shavuos, that talked about Anochi, because Erev Shavuos, you read the 10 Commandments, and the first word is Anochi, of course. And I started reading this letter. At first, I didn't understand a word, but I stuck with it, and I started reading it. I think you and I maybe started learning it too. And I said, I really want to understand what's going on. And as I got into it, I realized several things. First of all, this was just an amazing analysis of the whole idea, which was just blew me away. But then at a personal level,
which idea?
The idea of Anochi, that Anochi, we all know, it's very famous. In fact, you ask any Chabad rabbi, what does Anochi stand for? And the funny thing is they all say, Ana nafshi kasavis yahavis. That third word, kasavis, is incorrect. That is not what the Talmud says. You can look it up, Shabbat 105a. It actually says kasivat, not kasavis. So then I quiz them and I say, so why do you say kasavis? And they say, well, that's what the Rebbe said. I said, great. Why did the Rebbe say it that way? Okay. And so I managed to figure out why the Rebbe says it that way, because he goes by the Girsas Ein Yaakov, the tradition or the text of the Ein Yaakov version. And there's a reason grammatically why, because that is the active tense of the verb as opposed to a passive tense of the verb. But there's two other acronyms in the Talmud, explains Reb Leivik. And by the way, two of them are forward acronyms. One of them is a backward acronym. And in the Yalkut Shimoni on the same thing, two of them are forward and one of them is backward, but one of them that's forward in the Talmud is backward in the Yalkut, and one of them in the Yalkut is brand new altogether. And and you start analyzing, what is an acronym in the first place? And if an acronym is made up of the first letters of each word, why the first letter? If all of the letters are vessels for godly insights in Hebrew, why not the middle letter? Why not the end letter? What is the first letter? And he analyzes every angle of all of these acronyms, and it's eye-opening. Eye-opening. It's fascinating. And on top of that, when I realized, and I started looking through the volume of all of the writings and primarily the letters, I realized this was written Erev Shavuos from the Rebbe's father to the Rebbe. Previously, he had written one on Pesach. After that, he wrote one on Rosh Hashanah. After that, he wrote one on Sukkot, all during 1928. These were letters, not just from a Mekubal, a Gaon, a genius father to the Rebbe, who was, of course, not then the Rebbe. It was a letter from a 50-year-old father to a 26-year-old son. And it was written Erev Chag, when you're looking around the table and you want to be with your children, and your children aren't there. His father was 1,000 miles away. He was in Dnipropetrovsk, which is now Dnipro, which is all in the news about the Ukraine. And the Rebbe was with the Frierdiker Rebbe in Riga or Berlin, depending on what particular time you're looking at. And how do they communicate? By letters. And yet he writes the letters specifically Erev Chag. Why? Why doesn't he write it ahead of time so that he would know that his son gets it on the Chag? That would be a logical thing to do. But no, he explains in the letter Erev Pesach, he says, I'm writing this on Erev Pesach, and I know you won't get it until after Pesach. But we go by when the person writes it, not when you receive it. And in other words, when a father blesses his children, Erev Chag, that message is being sent. When you get the piece of paper with all the writing is not relevant. I'm giving you that bracha. You should know that, and okay, you'll see exactly what the words are later on. And he believed that. And can you imagine the chief rabbi of Dnipropetrovsk at the time, from I think 1908 to 1939? He was the chief rabbi, Erev Pesach. He's the one who brought matzah to Dnipropetrovsk in the first place, which now, by the way, you buy Ukrainian shmura matzah, handmade matzah. Thank him for that possibility.
I never thought of that.
But it's just unbelievable that he would take the time, with all the things going on, to write his son a letter. That was important, and he had to write it. And they're beautiful, beautiful letters that have a real, as they say, I think you taught me this once about a Hasidic kiss. This is a Hasidic kiss from a father to a son.
So hearing about the letters, and you wrote a work called Unlocking the Code, which focuses and reminds us of the following, and I'd like you to say if you explain a little bit about it. Is it really, in your opinion, is it really practical and I emphasize that word, is it really practical for your average Jewish person? And I'm going to say religious or not observant, not yet observant, as Chabad says, to study these letters naturally, with in Hebrew, English, with a teacher, you know, and to benefit from them, and how. That's one thing. The other thing I want to ask you about is, what do you see? Because you've now delved into it. You've spent so much time. I mean, and frankly, you brought me into this world. I was like everyone else. I don't go there. I learn Hasidus. I learn Gemara. I learn Halacha. I give lectures. I give sermons. I verbring. But Reb Leivitz, you brought me there, and it's interesting that my mashpia, Reb Yoel Khan, of blessed memory, passed away this year. We're still celebrating his first year of passing. He started in 1970 when the Rebbe asked to publish the first works of one of his fathers, and they published it in 1970, I believe. He got into it. Until then, he also wasn't into it. So the question is there practical relevance to it? And number two, what does it tell you about the relationship between the Rebbe and his father, knowing full well that they were 1,000 miles away, and once the Rebbe left to his father-in-law, he never saw his father again, and that's very painful. And everything else that happened, we know that he was taken away, imprisoned in 1939, and ultimately passed away in 1944, Reb Levi. Mm-hmm. Do you feel that the letters bound them together, connected them, and in a sense, it was the letters that made the relationship fresh, wonderful, and special? So those are my two.
Okay, so let me tackle the second one first and the first one second. Okay, so in terms of the relationship between the Rebbe and his father through the letters in particular, but I'm sure it's also in the other writings. For me, I hear, when I study these letters, it's like I'm eavesdropping on a conversation. Even though you don't hear the Rebbe's response, you hear in the way that his father explains things, where he'll say, well, don't worry about X, Y, or Z, because he knows that his son would have said, well, what about X, Y, or Z?
Right.
And where he'll say, I wrote about this in the margins of a sefer in the library on a midrash somewhere, and maybe you saw it there. And so you see, and I'm not talking, by the way, about there are certain letters that were personal in nature, much more personal. Those were not released for publication as far as I know. And then there were some letters that were more practical oriented, like right before the Rebbe's wedding, where they were instructional and what you have to do. Right. But I'm just talking about the other letters. I hear the conversation. I sense that conversation. So it's almost like I said, like if you could listen in on a conversation between Isaac Stern and Yitzhak Perlman, the two greatest violinists, talking about violin playing, you wouldn't understand a word they're talking about, but it would be fascinating to listen to that. And you have this opportunity to hear what how the Rebbe speaks to his son. And that, like in stuff that's printed for publication, it goes through.
You mean how Reb Leivik speaks to his son?
I'm sorry, how Reb Leivik speaks to his son. Correct. Thank you. So in items written for publication or more general, it goes through editing, and you have an audience of an indeterminate number of people, and you got to be careful how you say it, and et cetera, et cetera. But when you have a letter written from a father's, these weren't written for publication. Ultimately, the Rebbe let them be published, but they weren't written for that purpose. They were written because he wanted to talk to his son. And so you're seeing how he really would express himself to his son. And so you can hear the son's response, even though it isn't there.
Right.
So I think it did affect, and where you see the response is as it plays out in the Rebbe's Sichas and the Rebbe's Maimarim, particularly after he started quoting his father more frequently. And you can see in various Sichas and Maimarim ideas, even if he doesn't cite his father, if you've studied the father's explanations, you see how the Rebbe then took it to the next level.
You're referring to the Purim.
We saw that in the Purim letter. There's another one with the Pesach letter with the 4 cups of wine and the 3 matzahs, and the Rebbe gave sichas on that.
Yeah.
And you see that coming also in Rebbe Levik's writing. So even if he doesn't quote him, you can just see the influence. So I think that relationship, you know, and the fact, the other point I'll make, and then I'll talk to your other point. The other point is that all those years, so in 1928 to 1939, he's getting letters from his father. And through all his travels, whether it was from Riga to Berlin and all around where he went and ultimately to New York, the Rebbe kept these letters with him. They were sacred. They were a part of him, and he kept an index and a little list by date of each letter. I mean, these were very precious letters to him. So yes, I think it really is reflective of the relationship. The practical thing, it's a great question, because I called my series of translations "Unlocking the Code," because when I approached a Chabad rabbi about, did he ever study Rabbi Levi, he says to me, nope, it's written in code. So I said, all right, I'm going to call it "Unlocking the Code." So let's unlock the code. Let's see what's there. Because if you really do, you find practical things. So as one example, I'm going to be using actually by Pesach at the Seder. And Reb Levick explains in detail how the organization of the Seder is 2 cups of wine, followed by matzah, followed by matzah, followed by 2 cups of wine. What's going on? Okay. And he explains the Kabbalistic significance of the wine representing Bina, or a deeper extension of your intelligence, which goes up to Chachma, which is matzah. And then Chachma, which is matzah, leads into Bina. And when you start thinking about it, you see the practical implications of it. A very simple example. Let's say that you want to get married. You find someone, you are attracted to them. That's Bina. Then you learn about them. And that's your Chachma. And then once you're armed with that Chachma, you can take that Chachma and convert that back into a Bina level of understanding that is much deeper than the Bina that you started with in the first place. And so that arc of, and the Kabbalistic phrase we know is Chacham
Chacham Bebina?
Right.
What you're looking for?
Right. So Havein b'chachma b'chakem b'bina. Okay. So you go from that arc is what you follow, and we do this all the time in our practical lives. We just don't realize that that's the process that we're going through. Another one which I studied recently with my future son-in-law, the Rebbe wrote a letter. Thank you. On the Tanaim. And on the Rebbe's Tanaim. And there he speaks about,
if you don't mind, what a Tanaim?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, the Tanaim, the contractual engagement contract, if you will, between the bride and the groom before the wedding, which today we do right under the chuppah all at the same time, or before the chuppah with the ketubah all at the same time. But years ago, they would do it in advance. And the Rebbe, in fact, signed his Tanaim, his condition document, 8 days before the wedding. And so his father wrote a letter explaining the Kabbalistic significance of the Tanaim. And there's Kabbalah and there's a lot of learning there for sure. The practical point, what is a wedding all about? A wedding, first of all, Tanai means conditional. It implies a level of doubt, he says. Suffix, doubt. What kind of doubt? And he says, not doubt for tzad hashlishi, for the third side, but he doesn't explain what he means. I think what he means, the way I interpret what he means, when you have a contract as a lawyer, when you have a contract, you have the party of the first part and you have the party of the second part. Then there's the outcome of the contract. If you fulfill the conditions, then this is the outcome. If you don't fulfill the conditions, this is the outcome. That outcome is the third side. Okay? Mm-hmm. So he says, no, I'm not talking about that kind of doubt. That's a doubt you just don't know. It's knowable based on the conditions, but you just don't know it today, but it's knowable. I'm talking about a doubt, a level of unknowability. When you get married, it comes from this level of complete unknowability. That's what you're walking into. How do you do that? And he explains how the Tanaim are an interconnectedness, meaning, and I'll cut through the Kabbalah here to get to the gist of it, which is you can have red, you can have purple. If you mix the two, you get, red and blue. If you mix the two, you get purple.
Right.
Is purple red or is it blue? It's neither, but it's both. And in your lives, when you get married, you are going to be interconnected in that same way where you are husband and wife, but you're this third interconnected identity where you're both together and you're both the husband and the wife because you are so interconnected that it's this new entity. So it has a lot of deep meaning and practical significance when you're sitting down with someone to tell them, you know, you're getting married. Let's talk about what that really means, what that relationship really means. And that's what he's explaining.
And what you're saying, the way you laid out, you wrote your work is structured that way, where you take the letter and you give both I'm not going to say verbatim, but a pretty accurate and close translation of the letter. The more Kabbalistic ideas you put into the footnotes, and then you also give us an essay, mm-hmm. a practical takeaway from the letter. And that I think is phenomenal. I really do. Because you got to have something practical to walk away with. Yes. And I think we've spoken about how for many people, you know, they go right to the essay, right. which is fine because ultimately, you know, when they'll have a little more time or a little more patience and interest, they'll go back to the text. Also, your English writing is phenomenal. I mean,
thank you very much.
I don't have to tell you I'm a writer, but your writing is of a different quality. You know, your background and education comes through, and it's really, I mean, quality writing. So that's very helpful.
So the essays, I'll tell you something great about the essays. What's beautiful about the essays, I mean, I wanted the essays to resonate with people. I would take one point out of each letter and write something about it and say, just like Rebbe, okay, but just like the letters are from a father to a son, I worked on those essays with my son.
That's right.
So we worked together, and I would bounce, he's a clinical psychologist, and I would bounce ideas off of him. I said, what do you think about this? Can you help me explain this idea in your experience? How does that work? And so we worked on it together. So it was another practical outcome of
father and son
writing. Yeah.
I want to now also talk about what I mentioned earlier, your work for Chabad on campus, and mm-hmm. This is very important. And what do I mean? Today we have so many young people who are Jewish, and they go out to the universities. Can you please address this, because these are the future leaders. You know, you and I were already, you know, we're over the hill. I mean, we're doing our best and we're contributing and absolutely, you know, the Rebbe teaches us there's no retirement. And I think we
Nope.
both, Baruch Hashem, are doing that. But nevertheless, you have the young people. The challenges on campuses, sometimes the anti-Semitism, all kinds of issues. And you've told me how, and I think I remember you actually went out to Cornell, I believe,
Yep.
where you led a session of how to be a Jew in a legal setting on campus and future work as a lawyer. And this is something unique that only a person like yourself can share and must share with young people. And I remember you told me another thing, I remind myself now, where an Orthodox mother, I think, had written to you, or maybe had actually met you, and she was all concerned about her son's orthodoxy. So to me, your work now and forever will be really as a go-to person, who, someone who's learns Torah, who keeps Torah, is interested in Yiddishkeit, in the growth of the Jewish people, and at the same time is a prominent lawyer. So talk a little bit about this, because it's very, very important.
So yeah, I do. I mean, one of the things that attracted me to Chabad on campus, just as an organization, is because of the importance of the shluchim on campus and what they do, and how they, how these, shluchim,
Emissaries.
how the emissaries of the Rebbe, the shluchim, the on-campus rabbis and rebbitzins, how they, manage with such an incredible positive attitude and no judgment, and how they go from almost nothing to all of a sudden they have 100 people at a Seder, or they'll have, they'll shoot for, in fact, one on-campus rabbi that we supported was telling us how great it was that he was going to have a Shabbat, 100. I said, no, how about a Shabbat 180? And so, we're constantly pushing, to do more, and they do it, and people are attracted to it. I think what happens on campus is students are attracted to the authenticity and to the non-judgment of just, I just want to be here for you as, the home away from home, whatever it is. And people gravitate towards that. They really do. And there's no mission other than, I want to teach you how to be Jewish, teach you things about it. So for that. Now, the other thing is when I speak, and I've spoken on many campuses and many groups of young people, also in Crown Heights, where we did the Chabad Young Professionals program, I speak about being Jewish in a secular world, is what I call it. And things you can do to bring your Jewish identity out and know that it's part of you, things that I do, okay? And I said, and what I teach is, if you are open to it, if you don't shield the outside world from your Jewish identity and you open your Jewish identity to the world, you will see things open up. Is there anti-Semitism? Yes, there is. And I do not mean to minimize anti-Semitism at all. It's a serious issue in a lot of places, on campus and in some cases off campus, of course, as we see. But those incidents shouldn't deviate from you and what you have to contribute to the world, and what you have to contribute to yourself and your family, and how you can really connect with people at a different level. I mean, I'll just tell two quick stories of, how this plays out. Where I had, I was, there's so many stories, it's hard to pick just one. All right. So anyway, I had a client that was down in South Carolina, business, and I had to go meet with them. Now, I hadn't been there for 5 or 6 years or whatever, and I had to go meet with the board of directors to explain a certain program. So I get to the building and I go up to the executive suite, and the receptionist says to me, "Oh, you're Mr. Hamburger?" "Yes." we have your kosher food for you right here. I never asked them. I never said, would you please prepare kosher food for me? But someone there knew, one of my contacts there knew who I was, knew what it meant, and on his own got me a kosher meal, all wrapped, everything else. So that opportunity was just great. Another meeting I had where I went down for meeting number one. This was in Orlando, Florida. I went down for meeting number one, and there was nothing to eat. Okay, I grabbed an apple, a bag of potato chips or something. Lunchtime comes, nothing to eat. Okay, there was all these non-kosher sandwiches, but nothing I would eat. Okay. Right. So anyway, the director there, the VP of tax, says to me, Paul, eat something. Come on. We got all this food. I said, it's okay. I'm not hungry. I made all these. He said, and he pushed. So I said, listen, I keep kosher. And there's nothing wrong with the food. It's great. I'm sure it's wonderful food, but it's not kosher. And I keep kosher. He felt terrible. The next meeting, he comes back, and 20 people in the room, not one of them is Jewish other than me. And he announces that last time when Paul was here, I felt terrible because he couldn't eat anything. So this time I made sure to get him a kosher meal. Now I'm already crawling under the desks. You're like, what do you have to call me out, right?
Leave me alone.
And then he says, but because last time we could all eat and Paul could not, this time I got kosher meals for everybody. We're all going to eat kosher. So all of these people were ripping open like the double plastic, wrapped things, trying to break in to find whatever food they could find in this thing. The whole lunch, we talked about kosher. What does it mean? Why? What is it? And they're all asking me these questions. And this is what we're talking about. We're not talking about 401k plans and retirement plans. We're talking about what does it mean to keep kosher and why. And then one of the women picks out this document, and it's all in Hebrew. And she says, what is this? I said, well, that has the blessings after the meal that we say, all the prayers, and it's in Hebrew. And she says, because it says in English, not to throw it out or whatever. I said, yeah, because it has God's name and it's a holy document. And so we don't destroy it. We either bring it back to the restaurant, we deal with it appropriately. She got up from the table, she went into the garbage and picked out all the benchers that people had thrown away.
Wow,
so she could return. Okay, now that opportunity would never have happened if I wouldn't said I keep kosher. And look at how I was able, not me, look at the opportunity I was given to explain to this group of people who never would have known anything about kosher and what Jews do and everything else. It's, those opportunities, I have literally hours of stories of different things that happen. Some of them are in my Anochi book and some of them I talk about, but it's amazing what you will see if you just open yourself up to the possibility. And that's what I teach the kids.
Thank you. That's a very important thing to have people like yourself and really, the marching troops of Yiddishkeit. Us rabbis, and the Rebbe always said this. I remember him saying this, how Balabat and people who are not rabbis or in the workforce, they can accomplish something that the rabbis and yeshiva students and all the scholars cannot. So that divine providence, hashgacha pratit, in the work field, you see much more than we do. Finally, before we finish, it's we can go on here. It's really wonderful, but we do have to finish.
Yeah.
What's the plan for the future with your Rebbe Levic work? Because I'm waiting for it.
I'm really waiting for it too. I have in progress, almost finished. It's been taking me a long time for a lot of different reasons, but there's one very long 1934 letter that I am almost finished with. It covers Purim and Pesach. And after that, my goal would be to sort of collect all of them. And so I have right now this one short volume with just the 4 letters and those essays. They're also available on my website. I have a website called www.theanochiproject.com, and I publish them. So if people want to download them, you can download them there. And it's, and it's available. It's free. You can do that all you want. Send them around, share them. But my goal would be actually to put them all into a book, and maybe one or more books. We'll see. And that would be the goal, to pull them all together. I also want to try to find some common themes that we can maybe collect into ideas. I know there's a book called The Inner Perspective by Rabbi Block, and there's other books out there that sort of try to do something similar to that. I would want to do something a little bit more fidelity to the text, as opposed to extrapolating too far from the text in terms of translating the ideas. Explain the ideas as he wrote them, admittedly with a translation. And by the way, not only the Rambam, but the Rebbe, and they all had very clear ideas about what a translation should be and what it should not be. And a translation should not be a dictionary, okay? A translation is explaining in your own words with fidelity to the original text. And so that's really what I'm trying to do, and give people access to it. So
Right.
hopefully there'll be books. I'd like to speak a little bit more about it, with crowds and things like that, and teach it a little bit.
Well, I know that you've taught this in various venues, in Chabad houses in LA, at the Solo Chabad Shul, Rabbi Zion's Shul, and other places, and you've told me that it's been received so well.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just a matter of having more opportunities.
Correct.
And you also work, you study, you listen to Rabbi Dubov, who's kind of the master of Levitic in the Hebrew.
Oh, yeah.
He's published extensively, and I know that you're in touch with him, as well as Tzvi Friedman, the famous Chabad writer, who's a phenomenal writer and teacher, and you're in touch with them. So you're in good company, and there's no question about it that this is just the beginning. And God will bless you to have Yiddish nachas for your family and for your grandchildren, and we will continue bringing Reb Levik's Torah to the Jewish world, to the Lubavitcher world, the Sephardic world, the Jewish world, everyone, because it's phenomenal. So I thank you very much for being on the program.
Thank you.
Meaningful interviews today. And we wish you a kosher and happy Pesach, and we should be well and only have simchas, and only meet each other and speak with each other with warmth and care and love and feeling. And we will ultimately see a Mashiach, because that's what we're all waiting for. And I'm convinced that when Mashiach will see your work, he will say, that's a first. Hamburger, Shlomo Hamburger, Reb Shlomo Hamburger, you did something for me that no one else did. So, kol hakavod. Take care.
Amen. Thank you.
Sei gesund. Bye-bye.
Sei gesund.